Hi, welcome to The Next Step. As political consultant, Hap Ziegler and myself faced in the cold light of the election results that occurred across the United States in the last couple of days. We'd like to offer some thoughts about what's happened to what most progressives, I think we both will probably fit in that camp, find as a depressing scenario for the United States. The Next Step is broadcast on TVSB Channel 17 and on cable television in Santa Barbara County. It can also be viewed on Ustream and YouTube, and you can find those sites by Googling TV Next Step, the Next Step TV SB on Ustream, or TV SB The Next Step on YouTube, and see this show and other shows that have been done in the past by ourselves. So, Hap, welcome back. You and I did that pre-election show, and we really avoided discussion of the personalities and the candidates. We mainly talked about measures and issues of voter choices on the ballot. But now we come back a couple weeks later. We look at the message. What do you think? Was it about personalities, or about parties, or about policy?
Well, my first take is I think we have to separate most of the nation from California. California was a decent win for Democrats, more or less across the state. The nation, of course, I'm trying to remember some of the numbers. I think that there were 7 Republican governors that were reelected, 7 Democratic governors that were reelected, 22 new Republican governors elected, 0, maybe 1 now with Rhode Island, were elected Democrats. So my first take is that nationally, I don't think it mattered too much who the candidate was. I think the voters are crying out for change, which is, to me, totally perplexing. If you look at all the polls, Congress rates lower than the president. The Republicans rate lower than the Democrats. And the nation put Republicans in expecting change.
Well, here's my take on it, just trying to gather it. It seemed to me that an awful lot of the people who were elected were non-incumbents. I know there were incumbents who got reelected, but there was a lot of non-incumbents. And there is that mentality of throw the bums out that permeates America. Congress, as you point out, has got, as a whole, has one of the lowest approval ratings in its history of all the years that they've been doing these surveys, 100 years or more. Republicans, ironically, running around 20 in the low 20s in terms of congressional approval of congressional Republican actions. Democrats running in the low 30s, so better, quite a bit better, but still not very good. And yet, the Republicans took offices. And now, part of it was just the circumstances of the election in terms of what offices were up, what states were up, and who was running. But I think part of it, I really do think part of it was the idea that I'm not going to vote for another incumbent.
I think there was a strong reaction to whoever's in Congress. Now, if you look at the 400 plus members, or I guess it's 300, what is the number in the House?
435.
435, that's right. If you look at how many of those got reelected and were incumbents, well, most were incumbents.
That is not, yes, because they gerrymandered these districts to such a degree that 85 or 90% of them have safe districts.
Right, whether they're Republican or Democrat, right. But what you're referring to, I think, are the ones where there were true contested elections.
Yes.
And where they were, I think it was throw the bums out mentality.
I think it was. I think that, I haven't heard other commentators say this, but that's what I got out of this was, these are names I've never heard of before, against names that I do know, like Goodall or others, and people who I think would have had good credibility with their communities, and yet, even in Democratic majority or plurality areas. Okay, so that's, I think part of it is the anti-incumbency thing. Just let's get another group in there and see if they can't do better than these bums that have done so far, which is sort of discouraging in a way because it sort of validates the Republican strategy of obstruction?
Well, I think it's voting for X when you're trying to change Y. I
Well, they
think
did that.
there's no rationality.
Yeah, let's talk about that a
It's
little
just a
bit.
knee-jerk reaction.
Around the nation, there were some fairly, what we would clearly identify as progressive or liberal ballot campaigns,
Right.
voter
Issues.
issues on the ballots around the state. In Alaska, the minimum wage increase passed.
As it did in Arkansas.
Well,
Wait.
I'm going
Oh,
to
you
get to
did go
that.
through
Yeah,
it,
I'm going to go
okay.
through that. And they decriminalized marijuana. And yet they elected a Republican who opposed some of that stuff. In Arkansas, a minimum wage increase, and as we have talked about before the show, 62%, I think, of the Arkansas voters were for the minimum wage increase.
That's correct.
And what else happened?
The governor and the senator who were elected were both against changing the minimum wage.
So, I mean, where was the Democrat who didn't get elected on that issue, might ask? South Dakota, a minimum wage increase, a Democrat thrown out. Nebraska, minimum wage increase, same kind of results. North Dakota, by a 2-to-1 vote, defeated a proposed restriction on abortion, which would have defined, would create personhood for an unborn fetus. And yet they voted very conservative for their Senate seat.
Did you have a number on the personhood initiatives? I think there were either 4 or 6 of those that got defeated.
Colorado had the same kind of thing. It lost also. So why would voters support what we would call progressive ideas, not democratic nice ideas per se, but progressive ideas, at the same time they wouldn't support the Democratic candidate? Is it because the Democratic Party, and this is part of my bias, has abandoned the progressive side of its membership?
I saw an interesting article, another postmortem. I can't remember if it was the New York Times or where, but it stated, will the Democrats do as the Republicans have done and pull back from their far left position? I find that humorous.
It is
because
humorous.
I don't think that the Democrats are anywhere near a far left
Well,
position, the
we've
ones
been-
that are elected.
Yeah, go ahead. For 20 years, we've been watching this argument about where the center of America was.
And the whole center is moving right.
Yeah, and when they say, well, the person has to be a centrist, and they've managed to say anybody on what in the European society would be called social democracy, hearty radical left. Anybody in this country who espouses things like medical care for all or, these kind of things, public infrastructure improvements and things, is considered a communist in this country. I mean, basically. Just
A little overstatement, but I know what you mean, yeah.
And so they managed to drive the center farther and farther to the right. So what the center of American politics, for them to say that Obama is a leftist, Obama would be a centrist by any standard in any part of Europe and probably a center-right guy.
I think certainly by action,
Yes.
there's no question. By rhetoric, I think he would be a moderate left, but as many of the people who've supported him have stated, he hasn't followed through on much of his positions.
Yeah, and I think this is part of what I was trying to reach in a moment ago was if the voters are ready to vote for minimum wage increases, if the voters are ready to vote against abortion restrictions, if the voters are ready to vote for, say, marijuana decriminalization or not legalization, but decriminalization at least, if the voters are ready to have immigration reform and give driver's licenses to non-residents, if the voters are ready to, and 60 or 70% of the voters want single-pay health care, if the voters are offered these things and the Democrats have not provided leadership on those, is it any wonder that they don't trust the Democrats to give them what they want anyway?
Well, again, I would suggest to you that the Democrats did provide leadership. The Senate came up with an immigration proposal, and it passed bipartisan. There were Republicans that voted for it. And, I mean, that's a perfect example. There's another one that's not coming to mind right now. And the House, Bonner wouldn't even bring it up
But let me give
to
you.
vote, to even get an up or down vote on
Well,
it.
I agree on the maybe I agree with this.
And the other one, I think, was recognizing gay marriage.
Well,
That came through the Senate also.
Okay, let's back down. And for the first 2 years of the Obama administration, the Democrats had majorities in both houses of Congress, if you want to talk about Congress.
And blew it.
And they did nothing. They did not push anything of merit through. They allowed the filibuster to block appointments. They did not act in accordance with the will of the people who elected them. So I think part of the disillusionment, and one of the things that bothers me when I see these people say, well, there's a lot of anti-Obama atmosphere out there, a lot of anti-Obama feeling in the community, in the general electorate, and 43% approval, they always assume that that anti-Obama feeling comes from the right. They always assume it's just the right-wingers and the Tea Party people. But I know, as a Green Party member and others that I have heard, there's an awful lot of frustration, and it has been for a lot of us, that the Democratic Party and President Obama, who, as you said earlier, speaks a leftist agenda, doesn't act the leftist agenda. He's got an administration that's full of failures from the left point of view.
Again, I think you're echoing the voice of what happened in this election.
I think I am.
And sadly, I think some of it is unfair, but fairness doesn't enter into it.
Well, let me give you a list of some of the things here. Latinos didn't come out. One of the complaints that the Democrats have is that the Latin vote didn't come out, or Hispanic vote didn't come out. So Udall and others who could have benefited didn't get it because Democrats didn't really push for immigration reform. They tried to work with the Republicans and come out with something, and Republicans just slow-played it to death.
Well, yeah,
women seem to be backing away because they had the Lilly Ledbetter Act, but not much since then. Progressives were miffed by the Obamacare program instead of single pay and expansion of Medicare. And I might want to say on that, in the state of California, we had this proposition that would have allowed a oversight on the Medicare rates, insurance company rates in California. It went down to defeat, and most people are attributing its failure because people who were defending Obamacare came out against it. So once again, Obamacare, which is a protection for the insurance companies, in my opinion, got in the way of a real progressive idea that we could have had in California, with somebody watching the rates like they do automobile insurance.
Right.
Environmentalists are bothered by the dithering over the pipeline from Alaska, and also by Obama's protection of coal and atomic energy. He actually advocates for atomic energy projects. Labor's bothered by the Democratic support for trade pacts that we've talked about on the show.
The multinational trade pacts.
Right, which undermine the workers' salaries. If I remember correctly, the Labor Relations Board has been unable to act because they couldn't get the appointments on that board to do something to give unions a little bit more power in the workplace.
Well, but whose fault is that?
I think it's the fault of a weak administration that didn't do something when they had the power to do it, and had they done this instead of trying to mealy-mouth around it, tiptoe around it, be nicer. Sorry. They might have encouraged even more people to vote for them in the future.
I think we as progressives in the Democratic Party suffered from the naivete of Obama's first 2 years. He thought a rational, willing to negotiate, mediation-oriented approach could work in a government that had been taught by Newt Gingrich and people that dug in their heels. And we did, I think the whole country, Republican or Democrat, except for some maybe 1%, suffered because of that 2 year learning experience. You listen to Obama now, he speaks so differently than he did in those first 2 years. He's saying, well, I'll work with Congress or without Congress. You never heard those words in the first 2 years.
Well, he doesn't have a Congress to work with now.
Well,
he had it then.
Yeah. And the interesting thing to see is, I guess I'm maybe naively optimistic, is Truman, Clinton, both worked with the House and the Senate stacked against them. Mm-hmm. And maybe, and when they did, both those presidents passed laws that I think you and I would consider progressive or liberal for that time. And so it'll be interesting to see how Obama, if Obama can work with this Congress, because here's the interesting thing. When it comes time to elect in 2016, you can't point at anybody else except yourselves as Republicans in Congress.
Well, I've heard this argument by the Democrats, but that's one of the problems with the two-party system. They always assume it's either us or them. We're going to embarrass them now. We're going to make them look bad like they made us look bad. Instead of having a situation where they actually took responsibility and proactive responsibility for the country. Let's take the Attorney General, somebody that we've talked about outside this program. We have 6 years of an Attorney General who loved Wall Street. This man couldn't have been kinder. Not one person involved in the biggest scandal, the biggest theft in the history of the world has been criminally prosecuted by our U.S. Attorney General that is a close personal buddy of Obama. On my personal level, that's one of the most offensive things about the Obama administration. Anyway, so it's accumulation of these kind of deferences, of delays, of accommodations, of backing away, of not wanting to pick a fight, of talking about, next 2 years they're going to look bad and we'll come out okay. We're at this long-term strategy that has caused a failure. We're going to have a U.S. Supreme Court which will be just god-awful if, God forbids...
For our lifetime.
For our lifetime.
Your lifetime and mine.
Yeah, well, my lifetime is, which people should be worried about your lifetime. You're a young man. Yeah, but no, so I'm worried. I mean, I'm upset. I was upset when we saw them, when the Democrats started working with Wall Street and got rid of the regulations of banks back in the turn of the 90s, the late 90s and the early 2000s, and that's when
the Democrats went along with that, by the way.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that and Clinton and the group. And that's when I left the Democratic Party. And now I think more people are saying, okay, call me an independent. In so many states in this nation now, I think in Massachusetts, over a third of the population is what they call independent or declined to state.
I believe there was just somebody that last evening that said Massachusetts is pretty evenly divided, 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 independent, not
Right.
American independent like California, but as we would say, no party preference.
Right, and so the party registration in both parties has been falling around the nation as people have either declined to state or independent. But let's get back to that, because that's something that we've also talked about in the past. One of the things I think is frustrating for people like myself in this election and other elections, I'm in California, so I don't get to vote on some of these other things, but maybe my feelings are similar to others. I end up with a ballot. I looked at the ballot and the names on the candidates for office in this election were people I could care ho-hum about. You had the top two primary. You've got two sort of the big money people, the people with the most money and the most name recognition got on the ballot. And there was no real, I could not see a discernible difference between their policies that made me want to support either one. So I didn't participate. I didn't vote for them.
You're addressing the fact that, 4 years ago, California said the top two vote getters in the primaries appear on the ballot, which eliminated Green Party, American Independent Party, and some of the...
Peace and Freedom.
Peace and Freedom, right. I happened to look and passed on to you the makeup of the Knesset. That's the Congress, if you will, for Israel. And correct, I didn't bring it with me, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there were 8 different parties represented.
Right.
Where the top 2 or 3 parties had about the same number, and the smallest party, I think, had 1 or 2 seats. And a lot of people say, well, that's chaos. But I think that allows people that have a specific issue or set of issues to be represented.
Exactly.
And they're part of the negotiations. What we're seeing, and I think this is what frustrated most of the voters in the United States, that voted crazily, I think. They voted for the party that they least, that they think caused the most problem and nothing getting done. They voted for that party to get something done. I mean, if that isn't an oxymoron. But if we had more parties, then people would have a way to get some expression in the actual government for their views. Now, do those parties in Israel that have 4 or 5 representatives out of the 100 or whatever it is, do they get their way? Not very often, but they probably get changes in legislation. They probably have input to get a consensus,
Exactly.
to get a majority, to get their laws voted. And so we lack that.
Yeah, and I think that coming back to the results of this immediate election, I think part of that, the failure of American democracy that we're seeing is accelerating, because voters, by and large, feel that they are not given choices. They're not given a meaningful choice anyway. They're given a choice between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. So you see the Tea Party people, for example. I mean, with due respect to the Tea Party, there was a lot of frustration and anger there that they felt their voices were not being heard, that they didn't have anybody in elected office that would actually respond to their concerns, because everybody was in this cluster to the middle and trying to be the nice, the safest candidate. When people were mad because Ralph Nader ran as Green, and
2004.
and because I ran as Green, but because there were people on our side that said, I'm so tired of having somebody in the primary in the Democratic Party tell me how they're going to do single pay, or they're going to do this, or they're going to do all these things, and then when it gets down to the closer we get to the election, the more centrist they get, and when they actually get in office, they don't do anything. So I do think there's a certain amount of this frustration, and as you know, maybe as a historian or political student, the idea of how do you select representation is a really interesting art. Proportional representation, a way of having the various groups in a society represented so they can get together and have their views heard, is most clearly the best way to do it. But it's something that American politics is running away from.
Yes. When you say they're running away, America's running away, what I'm seeing is a disconnect between the representatives and the populace. Things like immigration change, I saw several polls that were in the 80s. 80% of the people in the United States want to see constructive immigration change.
I understand.
And we have a Congress that won't change it.
But that's my point.
And on and on. there's probably issue after issue where we find the same
I made
thing.
the list early on. 70-some% want single pay health care. And
I don't know if
nobody.
I think it's 60, but anyway,
It
but
was
it's
72
high.
at one point.
Yeah.
Back in the time when this was
Right.
being discussed.
Right.
Now there's a few people got sopped off by Obamacare, quote unquote, but there's
Is
still
that a
a huge.
technical term?
Whatever phrase you want to use, they got placated, slightly. But so American public opinion is not attended to. Money is paid. This is the most expensive election, mid-year election by far, maybe one of those most expensive elections. I was watching the French news broadcast about this a couple nights ago, and they were just talking about the $6.5 billion or whatever it was that was spent on off-year races in the United States, and what a circus it is. There's nothing equivalent to that in Europe, I guess.
Well, part of it is the whole parliamentary procedure is that they call for an election. There's a 6-week blankout period,
Yes.
and the election's over in six weeks.
And you can't campaign the last 2 days, I think, in most of these countries. So
Yeah.
there's a blackout period at the end, so you don't have these surprise embarrassments on the front page of the local newspaper. So anyway, so let's come back to what happened in California, and maybe just, we did in California pass Measure 1, which Jerry Brown wanted, on the water project, and you and I had sort of a
We had a
mixed thumb up.
reluctant thumbs up on that one.
Yeah, and they passed the budget reform, which I think we both agree was a good idea.
Yes.
So that was good, and but they just shot down personal injury reform on medical malpractice because
Heavy
of money,
campaigning, yeah.
big money, big amounts of money. And as I said, they shot down the insurance commissioners, the power to
Review, right.
review medical care rates or insurance rates. That was terrible. I was surprised by that.
The reducing some of the crimes from felonies to misdemeanors passed.
Absolutely, amazingly.
I was actually amazed on
I
that,
was
too.
stunned when I first saw the results of that 60-70% approval, which again is what I'm talking about before. There is it's been political truth for most major political parties for the last 30 years. You can never go wrong by voting for more crime punishment. By building more prisons, hiring more guards, and making longer penalties has always been the way to get elected in California for the last 30 or 40 years at least. Here, quietly, somebody puts on the ballot reform of that, and it overwhelmingly finds public opinion approval.
Yeah, and And probably most of the people that even voted for it don't realize the millions, tens of millions of dollars a year that will
can
be
save.
saved because of that.
Well, I talked to a friend of mine in well, I'll just say it, the public defender's office. And even though, of course, he is extremely in favor of this, as most people in our line of work would be, he points out that this will reduce their felony caseload by maybe a third. And that means fewer lawyers and fewer, so somebody's going to be, let go if nobody quits. So there's going to be reductions. But that's exactly for us as citizens, that's part of that amazingly large overhead that we were paying for our law and order fascination that we've had for the last few decades. So that's a really
I was also
thumbs up thing.
fascinated on Prop 48, the referendum for the casino
Oh, I was
and
amazed.
the
that-
revenue sharing, that was shot down.
Well, no, I thought maybe it was just a local Santa Barbara phenomenon that we voted no against the casino because there's all this hostility toward the Chumash. But it turns out maybe a statewide hostility.
That's a statewide, yeah.
And this was a scummy deal, a really scummy deal. We didn't actually get to it in our last show. I was sorry that we didn't because I found it offensive, what they did. But so there were some good things in California.
And something good things in the nation, as you pointed out.
And good things in the nation.
And
So
first female governor ever of Rhode Island, and a Democrat, first Democrat, I think, in 7 elections for governor. So there is some balancing going on, but
I
it's
hope
not-
that the Democratic Party, and because that's the one that I would have closest affinity to, gets the message here. They need to get back in and represent the constituency that's their natural constituency. They stop worrying about corporations and banks and insurance companies, and go and help the working people of this country, help them get unions, help them have some better salaries, help them get better medical care. If they do this, I think they're going to have a better shot at it. Anyway, so here we are, winding down and getting ready for another 2 years of government, of perhaps crisis in Washington. Probably not much change in California.
I don't see much change at all in California as far as the state is, how it's run and where it's going. I think it's going to stay pretty much the same track it's been on. I did find it interesting that Jerry Brown's going to end up, he's finished his last campaign and he has $20 or $25 million still in the coffer.
Well,
Somebody asked, what are you going to do with that money? And he
It's
said,
disgusting.
I may use it to forward some of the propositions or endeavors that I would like to see move forward.
This idea that politicians get to spend that money on personal whims is really offensive, but we'll talk about that another time. So here we are, ending up another episode of aren't things awful in some ways, but some modestly optimistic thoughts. I want to thank Allie and Juanita and Tess back there in the studio for getting the camera work and the sound work, and look forward to talking to you all and being back here again in a few more weeks.